Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. Today, we have a really exciting interview with Max Altman, who is the co-founder of Apollo. Max is an investor and engineer, and at Apollo, they're building a new way to fund ambitious moonshot companies. So if you're a scientist who is considering starting a company, or if you're already in the process of building one, Apollo is a really great way to help you and support you as you get your company off the ground. So welcome to the podcast, Max.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
So we'll start off with this. The first question is, what is a moonshot? What exactly are you guys trying to fund here?
So we're still trying to exactly define that ourselves, but where we are now is we're looking for things that are not pure software plays. It doesn't mean they can't have software in it, but the core innovation should not be around software. Not that anything is wrong with software. We think it's great that a lot of people are starting software companies, but we're looking to fund non-software companies. And when we kind of think of moonshot, there needs to be a core innovation that is really hard to build. This is not just disrupting a business. It is building something that will then disrupt existing businesses.
So focusing on the core technological innovation.
Exactly.
So rather than using existing software technology to tackle a different market or have a different product, you're focusing on some new sort of technology or some new sort of scientific discovery and turning that into something that can be a product that impacts people's lives.
Definitely. And I think maybe another way to think of it is, right now we're kind of in a place where you either want to build a company that is 10x better than all of your competitors, or build something that is novel and doesn't have any competitors because you built a brand new technology. So the moat is actually the tech. I think that's really where we're looking rather than just trying to rebuild something and make it even slightly, make it incrementally better.
Gotcha. And then when they're talking about technology here, this is anything from like biotech, medicines or vaccines, or like cell-based meat to energy. Is there any sort of limit to the types of technology you're looking for, or is it pretty broad?
Pretty broad. No, I mean, we're seeing a lot of people with advanced degrees in biology for the things you just mentioned. We're seeing people with PhDs in chemistry, especially around some of the carbon capture technologies. And we're seeing people with physics and aerospace. People are looking at new electric planes or modes of transportation. So really, anyone kind of in the hard sciences.
Okay, that's great. That's very unique compared to a lot of other accelerators and investors out there. When you say things like aerospace or planes and like biotech and carbon energy, those are things that I guess biotech's been funded a little bit more, and there's some aerospace, but it's not nearly the same level of funding and activity that you see in software.
No, it's not. And I think historically they are harder investments. I mean, besides just having product market fit risk, you also have a lot of technical risk. Like it might just not be possible to do these things. You're also running into regulatory risk and not commenting on if regulations are good or not, but it just does make it harder. At any moment, the FDA can just end the company, or the FAA can just say this is not safe to fly, or the EPA can just say, hey, you can't engineer a plant in this way, and those don't exist in software. So it definitely is harder, but I think we kind of are at a stage now where there's more and more really smart people kind of want to work on this stuff. So I think it is time to start investing here.
Yep. And we could talk more about kind of the origin of Apollo and why now later. But it sounds like focus on moonshot companies attacking hard technological problems and trying to build really impactful products based on those innovations.
Yeah.
So what is Apollo exactly? How is Apollo helping these companies get started?
Yeah, so I think the goal is really just to get cash and then a little bit of mentorship to people that might not already have access to capital. We're not really thinking of this as a full-on incubator. A lot of the people that we have seen applying in the past are a little bit more experienced, or they really just kind of want cash and just they'd rather just have an investment and have us help them get roadblocks out of the way. Whether that's setting up and incorporating, getting it introduced to other investors down the road, getting introduced to advisors. We really focus on that rather than doing a ton of handholding and teaching them how to start these companies.
Got it. So it's providing sort of capital and a platform for these companies, and then some mentorship and connections along the way. But really just focus on providing capital to people who may not have access to it. So if you're a like a postdoc at, let's say, Stanford in bioengineering, and you are thinking about continuing in academia, maybe becoming a PI and opening your own lab, or you're thinking about going to work for a big company like Genentech, or doing consulting or being an investor, what are the reasons that people like this should start a company versus go after these sort of more traditional established career pathways?
Sure. So I think that most people probably should not start a company.
Yeah.
First off, like don't, if you just want to do it because it sounds cool, that's not a good reason. But I think probably the best reason is people who want to see their research get to market so that people can use it in scale. So if you're that person who wants to come up with a new synthetic biomaterial to put in clothes because you really want everyone to be wearing, more sustainable clothes, and you just really, really want to see everyone use your technology, I think that's maybe one of the best reasons to kind of start a company, because that way you can actually get it out of a lab and actually have exactly what you want. Make it a chance so that people are actually using your technology.
Yeah. So if you really want to see your technology applied, as opposed to just doing the research and publishing papers and all of that, if you're really like itching to have your product out in the world with patients or with customers, then starting a company could be the best way to do that.
I think so, yeah.
And is there so the other route for getting a technology to market is obviously going through like a bigger company, for example. How would you think about what kind of technologies and people are best suited for bringing their technology to market through working at Genentech or something, or starting a company of their own?
Yeah, I mean, it's very fair. I think there is, working at Genentech or, Pfizer or Merck or anything also are, great options for some people, probably for, the majority of people. And you do get to work on technology that gets to market. I think the difference is, some people that really have one vision that is just, this is exactly what they want to get to market. And if you are the co-founder, you can do that. Whereas if you work at a big company, you're more likely to be assigned a project and work on what someone else wants to. And not saying that's bad at all. That can be very good. So I think the kind of people just have one, maybe ideally it's someone who's been working on research for 5 years. And if they went to Genentech, they would work on something that's not that, but they really, really want to work on what they've been studying. I think that's kind of the perfect candidate.
Yeah, so somebody has an idea they've worked on for a long time. They know it better than anyone else in the world, and they really want to bring it forward. And so right now, if you're somebody like that, you have an interesting technology, maybe you started a company or got some grant funding, and you're kind of looking at the next step. Where does Apollo fit in? How do people apply to Apollo, and what should people expect to get out of it?
Sure. So yeah, like you said, we're kind of looking at people that have already made some progress. A lot of people have gotten, ARPA grants. This is not something they just, as an idea, but they haven't really started trying to bring anything to market. So the process is, we are likely going to be doing this twice a year, once in the summer, once in the winter. We'll open up the application to the entire world, to everyone. We don't want to make this something where it's only, inside Silicon Valley in the figurative speech, whether that is, Boston, New York, San Francisco, where you see a lot of investments. So anyone can apply, and then we're going to review every application and just look at everything, and then work to get it down to a smaller group, which we'll do interviews with, and then we'll pick about 5 companies each cohort and get funding. The funding is going to be $3 million because we think these companies need a little more to get started than they traditionally do.
Okay, so $3 million for each company. You fund, let's say, 5 companies at a time, and do it in sort of a batch process. It sounds like a summer and a winter batch. So that's pretty interesting. It's different from a lot of established funds on the one hand, right? Like a seed fund, people will come to you and they'll pitch whenever they're fundraising, and then you'll decide to invest in them or not. It's a little bit more like an accelerator, it sounds like, but it's different in terms of the check size, focus.
Yeah. Unclear if it's good or bad. Maybe something in the fall or spring comes along and, so they need money right now. And that will be difficult. But we think if you want to do an open application process where you have interviews and stuff like that too, we're trying to see if that's going to be better if you do it in this cohort way. And we also think it might be a little bit better in that, hard tech diligencing takes a while. And we know I have friends that are, applying for funding and are talking to investors, and they're waiting 3 months or 4 months to hear back. And, we kind of want to speed that process along. And we think with the cohorts, we might be able to do that.
Yeah, I think the funding and diligence for hard tech, especially historically, has been brutal, months and months and months.
Yeah.
It's not like something we're getting term sheets in weeks. So this is something where the turnaround time is much quicker.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. So you're doing it in this sort of batch process with cohorts. And I thought that was interesting as well. And that also kind of reminds me of like Y Combinator. And, if you read Paul Graham writing about the early days of YC, one of the sort of unintended advantages of that program was that they did this funding in batches. And I know a lot of the scientists, founders I talk to, or people who want to start a company, sometimes they don't do it because they don't really know anyone who's done it. They don't really have a peer group to support them through it. And there's not really, you don't have the same sort of ecosystem of advice and mentorship and support and almost like a playbook that's online for starting a software company. But for hard tech, there's not really a blueprint. You're kind of out on your own. So is it part of the idea that the cohort plan can help people feel a little bit more guided and supported in that path?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that, for SaaS companies, there's more or less a playbook. Like, it's very hard to execute on, but there is some sort of blueprint of how you're supposed to do it. And here there's really nothing. We're all kind of figuring it out as we go. And yeah, I think the goal is kind of have a community where people are going through the same problems. And, I think a couple people had already asked, like, well, why someone who's, like you said, doing carbon capture technology and also, creating a new therapeutic drug, why are they in the same program? Like, they don't really have that much in common. And I'm not sure if that's really true. Because, if you have a PhD in bio working on a new therapeutic and you have a PhD in chemistry working on a carbon capture technology, like, you're still working on a brand new technology. You're trying to hire great scientists that, are also aware and, don't know about how startups work. You're working with government and regulatory bodies. So I think there's actually a lot of similarities that these companies will go through, even if they're working on like vastly different products.
Yeah, and you're probably looking to tap the same investor networks and sort of advisory networks as well. And yeah, you're also, if you're starting a company like this, it's really sort of ambitious and technologically ambitious, there's not really, it's kind of a rare thing to do. Like your peer group, if you're a postdoc or a grad student, are working on ambitious problems, but not trying to go out and start this company on their own. Or if you're working at a bigger company, you don't have this, kind of being out there in the wild, trying to start a company on your own. And even if you're a software startup, there is that kind of established playbook, kind of established funding ecosystem. And it's not quite as crazy as starting a hard tech company.
Definitely, I would agree. There's a lot. I would sort of say here is like the unknown unknowns are a lot greater than the known unknowns. So it's like people come in and like they don't even know how they're going to be making money or like what crazy curveballs are going to be coming up. And I think in software that's also true. But here is just like everything is just kind of like a big black hole and people are kind of figuring it out as they go.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's cool that you all are also experimenting with different funding models and new ways to support these companies. I know there's been a lot of efforts in the past to support early stage biotech and hard tech companies. And there's been some successes and things that work super well, but I don't think no one's quite cracked it yet. But I think that you all have some interesting experience in working in that space. So can you talk a little bit more about kind of the team and the approach that you are working on compared to other ways of tackling this problem?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, the team right now is just me and my brothers Jack and Sam. Though, if things go well this summer, we obviously are interested in growing that and making that a little bit better for the winter. But the way we're looking at it is just having talked to people and kind of figuring out what they want and building it around there. So for example, what we're doing is we're looking at things like an equity swap. Like a lot of founders might have a partner and kids and they, it's a little risky to start a company, to put all your eggs in one basket. And investors get to have diversified investments, but founders don't. So one thing we heard was, is there a way to diversify that? So we're thinking of an equity swap where, founders, or say there's 5 people, 5 different companies, 10 founders. They all share a little bit of equity with each other. So that if they fail and someone else in the cohort succeeds, they get a little bit of that upside, which I think is kind of best for everybody.
So it's basically a way for, usually if you're a startup founder, you put all your eggs in one basket, a very sort of risky basket, so to speak. But with this program, you're able to diversify. And if your company doesn't work out, then you could still benefit in the upside from your cohort.
Yeah, and of course, like the vast majority is still owned by the founders. But it's just nice to have a little bit of a cushion around you, a little bit of soft landing in case you fail and someone else succeeds.
Yeah, and I do think that that's super important for founders of these kind of companies, because a lot of times if you have done a PhD or a postdoc, you're at the point in your life where you have a family or children in many cases, and you look at the world and risk in a very different way than like a 22-year-old coming out of undergrad, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, most of the people who are applying are not 21-year-olds sleeping on, in a hacker house on mattresses on the floor eating ramen. And again, nothing wrong with that. I think that's awesome that people are doing that, but it's just a different group of people right now that are applying.
Yeah, for sure. So you've got this equity split. You're giving people $3 million upfront, which will help with a lot of the sort of chaos and uncertainty that comes with raising funding for these. You're not scrabbling together SBIR grants or friends and family rounds to try to make something happen. You can get all your funding, and then you don't have to worry about spending your time on fundraising for a pretty decent amount of time. So that should provide some, I would imagine, security and stability as well.
Yeah, I think those are that's definitely spot on. We're trying to help there. We're also kind of looking to have what I would call like industry expert advisors. For example, I was a computer science major. I should not be advising a biotech company who is making a new synthetic biomaterial. We're really looking for someone who's like a chief scientific officer at another company who's done this for decades and brought something to market. So we are going to be bringing in outside advisors rather than doing a lot of that work ourselves for a lot of the day-to-day stuff for them.
Okay. So bring in sort of use your network to find the right kind of mentors for these companies, and not be too, because a lot of especially in biotech, VCs are very kind of heavy-handed in some cases with company building and things like that. But you want to be more trust the founders, let them do their thing, and support is needed. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. And then even goes to like, we're not in the interest of taking a board seat, of trying to bring in like an outside CEO and say, hey, here are 2 really brilliant PhDs, but we need to bring in some seasoned CEO to help them. I don't think that really ever has turned out well. I mean, there's probably examples I'm not thinking of, but they would probably be the exception to the rule. So we really want a founding team that can run this, to exit by themselves. We're not looking to meddle or tell them that they can't run this company without outside help. But that also being said, if you are someone who thinks you want outside help, it's probably not for you.
So this is for people who are sort of very entrepreneurial, right? Obviously, because they're starting companies, but not looking to start something and flip it to a fund and, have a professional management team run it, but people who really want to take it the distance.
For sure. And of course, I would say like, of course people need help with, fundraising and recruiting and everything too. But yeah, these people should be running the company for the lifetime of the company.
Okay. So that's, I think, one more question I have about how Apollo works and how it's different, and that's related to the application process. So instead of putting together a pitch deck and finding a way to get a warm intro to you and then going through a bunch of pitch meetings and diligence meetings and all this, you have a very different kind of application process. So can you describe the application process for Apollo?
Yeah. So basically, we are just having people write a couple paragraphs about what they're building. We're having people then write a couple paragraphs about who they are and what their background is, and then have them upload, a minute-ish video talking about, what they're building, why they are building it, and like why it's valuable. And then of course people can put in supplemental materials. Some people put in decks, some people put in research they published. But we want to democratize it a little bit, so it's not, it's okay if your deck is super ugly, and you have a really
Yeah.
great video.
Yeah.
We don't expect everyone to have beautifully polished. Because I think the videos are some of the most helpful things. So hopefully that will allow more people to apply, even if they don't have a background at all, or know people who have been entrepreneurs before.
Yeah. So this is basically, it's open to everyone, and you don't like give people a back door through Warminchers or whatever, where they can get fast tracked or something like that. It's just, you apply, you review the application, make the decision, go forward.
Yep.
So you said that the video application is super helpful. Is there anything specific that, makes a team stand out in the video application?
The way that I'm kind of able to describe it now is after hearing like their 1 minute pitch, if I'm like, oh man, I really want to go work for them, that is the best way to tell, in my opinion, because the founders are going to be telling that story, that same 1 minute story for the next decade. So whenever they're trying to recruit the best people, they're telling that story. Whenever they're trying to raise money, they're telling that story. Whenever they're trying to close a deal, they're telling that story. So if I can get really excited and be like, wow, I was just so kind of excited about what you're working on, you're so passionate about it, that's going to go a long way for them, I think.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the coolest things about these kind of companies in general. And obviously my experience is more in biotech, but some of the things people are working on are just like really cool, and you just get excited to learn about it, to hear about it, and just to be a part of it. So I imagine that you guys see a ton of super interesting stuff like that as well.
Yeah, well, exactly.
So on that subject, are there any like examples? I guess you can't talk about companies you funded, but other companies that you've worked with in the past, that would be like a good sort of prototypical example of a company that you would love to fund.
Do you mean a specific company or types of companies? Like,
Yeah, if you can talk about specific, that would probably bring it down to earth more, be more practical. But understand if you can't do that, and
sure.
if so, just kind of the general phenotype of what would be an interesting company for
Yeah.
you guys.
So I think a company off the top of my head that maybe I care a little bit more, passionate for me is like I think C16 that's doing synthetic palm oil is really interesting to me. I wish we had been doing this in the past, but we could have invested in them. That's just an example of people probably don't know how bad palm oil is for the environment. I think people are more aware that meat is bad for the environment, but if you look at Indonesia and Malaysia, like palm oil is the biggest, or one of the biggest, if not the biggest, issues there of people just destroying the rainforest to have palm farms, and then palm oil goes in everything. And if you look at your shampoo or like a chocolate bar, you're like, oh crap, there's palm oil in this. I didn't even know that. So, those are the kind of companies where people don't even know the damage they're doing. Someone's created a new technology to get rid of that, very bad thing. They are competing against something that is really hard because palm oil is really cheap. So they have to make something really cheap as well. But it's really exciting. And, they also might be following a playbook, which is interesting to me, which is like the European government is looking at potentially banning palm oil, period. So that's a great space to be in, of building something and, having a government heavily tax something that's bad for the environment or just straight ban it. And then you have to come up with an alternative, and they're there. So I think that's a great playbook, and just a really cool technology.
Okay, that's interesting. I hadn't heard of that before. So palm oil is used in a bunch of things, it sounds like shampoos, and like what else is used?
Anything kind. Chocolate is big. A lot of foods, and smooth things out and kind of have I guess creamy, oily flavor. And it's just not something that people even really think about as bad, because we talk so much about meat, and I'm not saying meat is good, but we forget about soybeans and cocoa and palm oil are terrible for the environment. I'm not sure if that's because people in the US don't go to Malaysia or Indonesia very often, and they haven't actually seen the farms, but I think people just aren't aware of some of those other bad, things that are bad for the environment that are happening all the time.
Yeah, and I personally am not, aware of the supply chain for palm oil either. I probably used it many times today, it sounds like, and hadn't even realized it.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. So basically, how is this process for farming or getting palm oil? How does that work right now?
I mean, right now you just go into Borneo, so like a Malaysian and Indonesian like jungle, and then you just cut everything down and plant palm trees,
Okay.
just like someone might do with soybeans in Brazil. And you can fly there, and I've flown there, and you literally just as you're landing, you just see rows and rows and rows of decimated forests and palm trees that are then ultimately just harvested for palm oil and put in things, and it's a very cheap way because they're in countries where it's really cheap to do this, so palm oil is extremely cheap. That's a huge issue that we have to overcome.
Yeah, yeah. So I think for a lot of these other companies that are doing like non-therapeutics applications of synbio, obviously the cost of drugs is really high
Yep.
per unit or per unit of mass, right? But for something like, I mean, even like the example of gasoline or clean fuel, you're competing with something that's like a few bucks a gallon versus a few 100,000 per year for a therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
No,
I
I mean,
think,
and I think the point you just said too of like gasoline is very, very like oil's really, really cheap. Like, and just because someone comes up with like a biofuel that's, great for the environment, but it costs $7 a gallon, that doesn't work. Like, it's just that's not going to work. So you have to be also be realistic. Like, are people just going to be cheaper than what exists, or almost the same price, and it's going to have a better brand? So just creating something that no one wants is not a good business either.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, it's a lot of other companies, not in the palm oil space, but working on this, and it's like the environmental benefits would be amazing, and just the idea of like replacing this huge like forest-based or farm-based operation with like a smaller lab with a footprint, and just make the world's supply of some sort of essential product in that lab. It's just like a crazy idea to me. I mean, it's very cool and compelling, but it's like almost kind of science fiction, and it seems like a world that we would want to have created, right? And be part of creating. If you can replace meat production through farms and ranching and things like that with a lab-based product, and do that for all of these other products that are really destroying our environment and harmful to the planet that we don't really, we don't realize the harmful benefits. That sounds like a very cool place to be, an amazing place to be as a society if we can actually pull that off.
Yeah, and I'm somewhat optimistic, or optimistic that we can get there. But I think it's gonna take people actually building a business. You can't just tell people like, "Hey, don't eat meat anymore." You need to give them something, like, for example, and it needs to taste good and it needs to be cheap, or it needs to be somewhat affordable. So people need to really be thinking about these as businesses, not just like as utopian ideas that will never take off.
Yeah, because it can cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to get this manufacturing scaled up to distribute it to people, and to get to a low enough cost where it's competitive. And I think one of the interesting things you mentioned with respect to the EU considering banning palm oil, that seems like a very strong example of how the consumer in markets could be changing as a result of some of these, products that are bad for the environment. But there's even obviously on the other side of the spectrum, some sort of grassroots movement, at least in the US and some countries, towards consuming, plant-based meat, or not consuming products that are created or harvested or grown in unsustainable ways. And if that leads to higher price points, then that could be a good entry point for some of these products to get into the market where they may not have otherwise. So are you seeing that as a big driver of demand and an enabling sort of phenomenon for these companies?
Um, I think it will be, in the sense that, let's say, for example, I think more and more people are realizing that like fast fashion really bad for the environment. You could probably argue that like, if you buy a whole set of new clothes, before vacation, like your clothes in your suitcase are much worse for the environment than the flight. And people seem to kind of talk about the flight more, but people are realizing that buying a bunch of clothes is really bad for the environment. So people want something that's a little more eco-friendly. And some people are willing to pay a little more. So yes, like I said, I think we definitely will see people caring more about that, and being willing to spend more for something that is more sustainable. And I also think we need to kind of remember that the U.S. often trails, I don't say other developed countries, but they often trail Europe and Canada in how they think about environmentalism. Like, if you talk to people in Europe, they're like, maybe I shouldn't be going on all these weekend trips and having a big carbon footprint. And everyone in the U.S. is like, hey, look at this cool trip I'm going on every week. I think that kind of will change in the US fairly soon.
Yeah, and it's interesting hearing all the. Sounds like there's a lot of. I mean, obviously it's a fund and you're investing in companies, but it sounds like the sort of environmental concerns and societal concerns are pretty strong in your mind. It sounds like.
Yeah, definitely. I personally believe that if we don't combat climate change, we're all probably going to die, or many people will die in our lifetimes. That's extremely bad. And the same thing, like, COVID really showed that, like, people are waiting like a week to get test results in the US right now. Like, that doesn't help anybody. Like, that's not, tests are almost worthless at that point. Is there, like, can we really not make something and get it to the masses where you get a result in 10 or 15 minutes? Like, the same thing goes to healthcare. It's like, we just need to do better. We're doing a pretty shitty job overall. And yeah, I think we think that, though, that a lot of this innovation will happen in private businesses. And that's kind of the hope here.
So how big of that was a factor in you deciding to start Apollo? Can you talk a little bit more about just the origin of this project?
Definitely. So I would say, not insignificant. I'm somebody who, I quit my job and I, became a scuba instructor for a year, and I'm underwater. You can see coral reefs dying every month. You go back and it gets worse and worse from coral bleaching, which is a direct result of climate change. So, like, you can always kind of see the effects underwater before you can see them on land. So for me, that was pretty big and pretty important. So I think a lot of it is that, but it's also just like, there are just so many people who want to go work for these kind of companies, but they don't exist. So if we can make them, maybe more people will kind of go work and work on solving these problems.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And like a lot of the companies in this space that I've seen, they're using like pharmaceutical stuff and like pharmaceutical reactors and stuff to work on these products, because most people I know that are working in these fields, especially with biotech, like when they think of jobs, it's in pharma or a therapeutics company.
Yeah.
Like, no one really thinks of like pursuing a career in clean meat or something like that. Although maybe that's changing, but I don't know if you were to pursue that career. I don't really know where you would go. To your point, like what companies would you even work at?
There's not a lot, but they're growing. And I maybe think one thing that also kind of needs to change is, for some reason, if you become a billionaire from making a photo sharing app, like, that's cool and celebrated. But if you, like, become a billionaire for working on climate change, or like a brand new diagnostic that saves people's lives, like, you're supposed to give that away for free, or like it's supposed to be a charity. And I kind of find that weird, because why should those people also, there's nothing wrong with the photo sharing app founder being a billionaire, but why shouldn't the person who came up with a life-saving medicine also make $1 billion doing that? So I kind of hope we change our mindset about how these bio companies are thought of from like a for-profit business.
Yeah, so a way to bring more awareness to this as a career path, building these kind of companies that can actually be really helpful to not just individual people and consumers, but to like society and the environment as a whole. And so you think now people are just not, there's not as many people working on this who could, and a lot of them are interested in it, but they just don't do it. So why do you think people aren't working on these problems, even if it is something that's important to them?
So yeah, so I think there is less funding here. There's a lot of funding for software. That's a good thing, but there's just not enough funding here, so there's not enough companies. They are, and I think a lot of it also, like I said, is like comes down to the risk tolerance for people that are able, or at a point in their life, to start these kind of companies. It's a lot easier to be 21 and go sleep on a mattress on the floor and work at a startup. And if it fails, it fails, and you can go do it again. But again, yeah, if you're in your low 30s and have a family, it's a different thing. So the profile's been slightly off, so we have to de-risk it a little bit. And then I think people also know that getting the second round of funding here, like that's $30 million or $50 million to go through, whether it is any sort of FDA trials or just stay in the lab for another couple of years and hire a bunch of scientists. Like that hasn't been happening a lot either. So you can get 3 million and then you can just fall apart after that. So that's also something we're focused on is how do you make sure that we can help get these companies another $50 million when they need to a couple of years from now.
Yeah. And how are you going to work on that?
So I think two things are happening. More people are starting hard tech funds. You might see that with, Amazon and Microsoft having $1 billion plus climate funds. A lot of other people are having $1 billion plus funds for life sciences. And then I think more, what we call traditional VCs are willing to invest in this stuff once it's been de-risked a little bit. So I think if you bring them enough quality things that have a product brought to market, which is really what we're focused on having them do during their first couple of years, then a lot of these $1 billion plus funds will be very interested in investing in them as well.
Okay, so that gets to another question I would ask is, what are you looking for companies to accomplish at the end of this? Is it a year or so that you?
Well, it's however long the $3 million lasts.
Okay. And what kind of milestone are you looking for them to achieve by that point?
Yeah, so what we're saying is we want them to have a roadster. So we choose that as an easy example, which is like Tesla Roadster wasn't really like that cool. It wasn't like, what they ultimately were trying to do, but it was something that they got to market. People paid for it. It was a proof of concept that there's also a market for this. And we're kind of looking for the same thing. So if you are coming up with a new diagnostic or new way to, a new platform to research diagnostics more quickly, which you see people doing that, we ultimately need you to have one, not just to have that platform and get something to market. It doesn't have to be the final thing that you're working on. It can be something almost like completely different, but using the same core technology. And we ultimately want to see someone kind of paying for whatever it is that you might build first. So we kind of hope by the end, whether that's call it 2 years or something like that, they're close to having something that they can actually go show to other investors that like we can actually make money from this.
So if you're, to use a cell-based meat example again, if you're a company working on cell-based meat, maybe they would have, a small like sample of meat, the initial sale of it.
Exactly. And they could be making pork and they made, and they made chicken. That's fine. It's just something, because that's easier hypothetically, something like that is kind of what we want to see.
And then for like therapeutics or diagnostics, you may have a really broad platform that can develop a bunch of different drugs or a bunch of different diagnostics, but having them sort of pick an initial application and then make some progress towards demonstrating, that it works, or if they can take it to the state of being a product, having done that. So not a big platform, but actually looking to see if you can build something that's a useful product for people to validate that your platform is useful.
Yeah, and I think maybe the best reason for that is I've seen, fairly often it's, you check in with someone who's working on a project in the lab and it's, been 3-4 years and sort of like, hey, we're still in the lab. And that's fine if you're doing research, but to get that to other investors is really, I don't think it's going to go over very well, because like part of it is like, hey, if you de-risk the technology, and if they don't have anything you can see, or you haven't brought anything to market, you haven't really de-risked the technology. So I think that's kind of, or you haven't de-risked it that much. So I think that's kind of why we want to see a product.
Gotcha. And then after they get to that point, they have some initial product. Then how do you help them raise their next round of money?
Yeah, so something we're still figuring out. But honestly, a lot of it sort of kind of seems like just sort of being a banker or anyone else in finance, where our goal is really to introduce these companies to later stage investors, a year or more in advance to when they're raising money. Like we talked about earlier, like these diligence processes take a while, things fall through, people are a little more hesitant to invest in this. So what we're ultimately trying to do is get them to meet with other investors way early on, tell them what they're working on, tell the investors what they're working on, so that when they do hit those goals, they can go back and they already have those relationships, and fundraising can go a lot more smoothly.
So even if a founder like doesn't go into Apollo, you would advise them if they're trying to raise funding or a larger round at some point to start building relationships with investors early?
Yeah, always. It's the same thing. It's like you wouldn't really want to do business with someone you've only met once or twice. You'd rather do it with someone you have a year-long, multiple year-long relationship with. And it's also great for people, for investors to track your progress. If someone comes in and says, "Hey, here's what we've done in the last 3 years," to me, that's a lot less interesting than someone I met 3 years ago say, "Hey, here's what we're looking to accomplish over the next 3 years, and here are our milestones." And then coming back a couple of years later and actually hitting those, that's much more impressive to me.
Yeah. And you can kind of help companies define those and communicate with investors proactively, and then obviously help them make that progress, or create the conditions where they can work really quickly to hit those goals and then tell the right story once they've actually had that success.
Definitely. And that's something that's like, not everyone might have that insight because they haven't, gotten funding from private investors before, and that's fine. So our goal is really kind of help them get the inside scoop on what's going to help them get more capital down the road. And then again, we're really just sort of like letting them drive the car and removing roadblocks along the way rather than trying to take over and drive the car for them, for these first couple of years.
Yep. That makes sense. Yeah. And then one other question I had is, if you are a scientist who's working on the startup, you take the risk, you jump into starting this company, and then if the technology just doesn't work for whatever reason, right? Like you have technical risk and you have some experiments to try to understand and de-risk that, but it just doesn't work out. Like, what would you advise a founder to do in that case?
Well, I guess the first question is can it work for something else? Is it like a complete waste of 5 years? That or is it sort of like, hey, you built something and you thought you were going to come up with this new synthetic biomaterial that just didn't work because it's just way too expensive, or it just is not possible to build? I think the first question is is there anything else you can do with your research? Because you see that all the time in software. It's like people go set out to build this one type of this one type of productivity software, and yeah, it doesn't, no one wants that, but what they really want it for is I don't know, some sort of team communication software, and it works for that. So yeah, don't pigeonhole yourself and see if you can kind of maybe have different use cases for your technology.
Yeah. And I think a lot of these platforms too, there's so many founders who the problem is they just don't know which application to go after. And if the initial one doesn't work, there's other options as well. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe we can wrap up with a couple more questions. So one, just kind of how Apollo fits into the ecosystem, and then finally with, how people can learn more about Apollo or even apply. But just the first question, it sounded like when you were describing why you started Apollo, a big part of it was that you wanted to do something that no one else was doing. You had a lot of people who are wanting to build these companies, a lot of technologies that have been developed to enable these kind of companies to be built, but there just weren't that many companies being built. So can you talk a little bit about the context, the sort of the industry context, as it is now, and why Apollo can provide something that is not currently available to the ecosystem to sort of bootstrap this moonshot building ecosystem?
Sure. So I think where we're trying to fill is we're seeing more and more people, put in $250,000 to some early stage bio companies. People can also go to get SBIR grants or ARPA grants for $1 million, and then also we're seeing more people put in $50 million, then ultimately strategics put in $500 million later on. But we kind of found that people that are looking to get 2 to 5 million, there's not a lot of investors there. I'm not saying that there's not any. I know of a lot of funds that I respect quite a bit that are investing in this space, but just as a pure number of dollars here versus the $3 million in software, there's just not nearly enough.
Yeah, it's sort of in the biotech called the valley of death, where you have something that's interesting, but it's not quite ready to have a lot of capital deployed against it, but it's almost impossible to get the funding to take it from the lab to a place where it could actually be in a well-funded company.
Yeah, and that's what we're hoping to solve, and also hoping that like the valley of death doesn't move to like that $50 million round and then they die there, because that would also be bad.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think at least in biotech, there's a pretty robust Series A and beyond ecosystem, but it's really missing that seed ecosystem. I talk even the top early stage biotech VCs, and they're like, who does seed investing? Like, there's not really anyone out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Like, you're really still betting on a team and like an idea of a technology. Like, the technical risk is still super, super high. And like you said earlier, it's like, since you don't even know exactly what your first product will be, because you could be wrong on that, like the regulatory risk could be really high, because like you don't even know exactly what it is you're finally going to be offering.
Yeah. A lot of risks, but it's very fun too at this stage. I think it's really exciting work with these kind of companies who are just like have enough interesting technology to have a ton of potential and be super exciting, and have super passionate founders, and then lots of really challenging things as well. But I think that I know some of the technologies that are out there today, the limits of them haven't really been tested too much. So super excited to see what some of these companies are doing.
Yeah.
So if people are interested in Apollo and want to apply, how do they do that? You guys had your first application deadline. Is that already passed?
Yep. Our first application, deadline was in July. We are currently reviewing those companies now. And then don't hold me to these exact dates, because we're still finalizing things, but we are looking to do this again in January. But that could be February or something like that. But assume that sort of timeline, and we will reopen it up for applications. Let's call it a month or so before that, and we'll do our best to get out the word to everyone, to make sure that we're getting the best founders applying.
So how should people stay in touch with you if they want to be reminded the next time you open up your application window?
That is a very good question. We do have a website, apolloprojects.com, where we will be giving updates, but I'm also in the process of creating a newsletter. So if you are interested, feel free to just write to info@apolloprojects.com, and I can add you to that newsletter, whoever is interested. And we'll probably send it out, not too often, but just when there's updates, so it's on people's radar of when they can start applying again.
Awesome. So I think that just about wraps it up for me. It sounds like a really, really interesting program. As somebody who's been in the biotech ecosystem for my whole career, have definitely long been hoping for someone to come along and like provide more seed funding to ambitious young scientist founders. And so it's super exciting to see that you guys are launching this. I know there's a couple other initiatives out there, but really cool to see what you're doing. I'll definitely subscribe to that newsletter, info@apolloprojects.com. And yeah, thank you again for taking the time to join today. This has been awesome.
Awesome. Yeah, great talking. Thanks so much for having me.